All right, good morning. Adjust the volume on the microphone to see if it's working. So just bear with me for 1 second.
Well, and I found that actually I have a because on my computer.
Okay. Test.
And I never, like, I was confused. I thought something was
Test.
doing.
All right. That's working. That's good.
I don't know how to get rid of it.
The equipment is all working today, which is great. So let me.
Yeah, I was telling you about my work, but I'm gonna try to uninstall Chrome.
All right, so we're gonna finish up. Last time I made an argument, and this is a nice segue. So just as a recap of what we did last time, and then today we're gonna move into logic and critical thinking. And then at the end of class, I'm gonna give you guys an assignment to work on in your groups. And I'll give you about 15 minutes at the end of class. I have to go to a doctor's appointment, so you can work it on your groups. If you want to do that by going to Teams or something else, because you've got something else that you need to do, you're welcome to do that as well. But that's what we'll do. And next time we'll discuss your answers to the question that I'm going to give you at the end that I want you to make an argument for. So I made an argument last time that it's important that we study things like philosophy and ethics in marketing, even though in a highly sophisticated, complex, technically advanced society, it would seem that the answers that we get from ethics and the questions that are asked are subjective and less prone to quantification than some of the harder skills, like how we go about analyzing big data and arriving at solutions that are going to benefit organizations in achieving their goals. And you know, marketing ethics seems to be more subjective than objective. And I sort of made an argument that I think that it's important that we think about these things, because ultimately the amount of power that we now have is so pervasive, and the amount and the ability to influence consumers is so pervasive that we really need to think about what it is that we are doing as a society, and the roles that marketing plays in that. So in that vein today, so that's an overview of what we started with. Where we're headed is today we're going to talk about logic and critical thinking, and then I will give you a critical thinking challenge to do in your critical thinking challenge groups that we will answer next time, a week from today. So this is part of it. This is a blended course, a hybrid course. So part of it is supposed to be done in class, and then part of it is supposed to be, you're supposed to be doing stuff outside of class. And so this critical thinking challenge is an opportunity for you to work in your groups to organize how you want to answer this question if you don't get it all answered in the 15 minutes that we have at the end of class. And you probably shouldn't get it answered in that time frame, because it's an enormously important question to the overall scope and direction that we are headed in this class. So logic and critical thinking is enormously important in this. If we say that ethics seems subjective compared to things like what is the answer to the question of what is the standard deviation in a data set, right? So if we have a formula that looks like this, that's the standard deviation. And this is what we call a measure of dispersion. And this formula looks pretty daunting. If I give you a set of numbers though, and you know the order of operations, we should all arrive at the same answer. And it's objectively verifiable. You either get it right or you don't. This is, again, called a measure of dispersion. And when we talk about statistics, it's an important measure. There are what we call measures of central tendency, for example, in statistics. That would be the mean, which is represented by this symbol, the mu, right? And what is a mean? Mean is a measure of central tendency, right? What are the other measures of central tendency? Anybody know besides mean?
Median.
Median is a measure of central tendency. What's the median?
Median is when you, depending on how many numbers you have,
Uh-huh.
you'll go through and find the direct middle number.
Okay, that's, yeah, so exactly, go ahead, pick it, Doug. The exact middle, so half of the numbers in a data set will be above and half of the numbers will be below that number. That's the exact middle. What's another measure of central tendency? Anybody know? The mode is another. What's the mode?
The most often number?
The most frequently occurring number in a data set. So if you have a large data set and you have lots of numbers, you may not have a mode if you have a very small data set, right? If we did, for example, a data set that involved grades in this class, you may not have two people that have exactly in a range of possibilities that go from 0 to 100. You may not have anybody that has exactly the same score right at the end. The other one is range, although some statisticians, I think, say that range is actually a measure of dispersion. So this is a measure of dispersion. It tells us how alike a set of numbers are, right? So if you have a huge data set and you have a wide standard or big standard deviation, the data is not very similar. I can give you a small example of this. And why things like mean are sometimes problematic when we talk about statistics. If you went to a homeless shelter where 3 nuns in a soup kitchen are feeding 35 people and Bill Gates walks in the room, the average salary or the average net worth, not salary, but the average net worth in that room just went over to over $1 billion, right? But it's 3 nuns, 35 people, and Bill Gates, right? So things like the median number would be more indicative of, the net worth of the group, whereas you'd have a huge skew because of the huge number of one individual in that very small data set, right? So those kinds of things seem objective. I mean, that's an objective thing. Now, the way we use statistics and the way we interpret some of the results of statistics obviously can lend itself to inherent subjectivity, but it seems more objective than things like, if I say things like, should we market contraception? This is something that is coming up as a result of the overturning of substantive due process by the United States Supreme Court. So in 1963, in Griswold versus Connecticut, the Supreme Court said that, so the state of Connecticut, like many states at the time, had a law on the books that said you could not possess, distribute, advocate for, or market contraception, birth control, right? That was against the law in 1963. Some of you have grandparents that were alive in 1963, probably. In Connecticut in 1963, now think about this. We think of Connecticut as being a conservative state or a liberal state now. It's on the East Coast.
Oh,
It's a fairly liberal state, right? But in 1963, you couldn't possess, distribute, advocate for, or market contraception. It was unconstitutional. In a case called Griswold versus Connecticut, the United States Supreme Court said that you have, between when a woman goes into her doctor's office, she has an expectation of privacy under the United States Constitution. Where is the word privacy found in the United States Constitution?
Amendment 4.
It's not. That's a good guess. The Fourth Amendment's important, The Fourth Amendment prohibits unreasonable searches and seizures, and the Supreme Court uses that amendment to say, Justice William O. Douglas, in that opinion, says that Amendment 4 implies, if you say that you are free from unreasonable searches and seizures, that implies a zone of privacy. Right? That implies that, like, the government can't come in to your house and just indiscriminately look at stuff. So in Griswold versus Connecticut, the Supreme Court says that based on the penumbras and emanations of the Constitution, a penumbra is a borrowed term from physics, as I understand it. When you have a solar eclipse, the moon moves in front of the sun, and because of the distance of the moon from the moon to the earth versus the sun to the earth, it appears that the moon blocks out the sun. And as it moves in front of the sun, you get a shadow area. So this is the sun, I'll use red here. And as the moon moves in front of it, I'll use black, you get since there's no gray, I'll use a blue. You get a halo effect around here, and that's the penumbra. The Supreme Court says in Griswold versus Connecticut, you have a right to privacy that's not found in the United States, explicit in the United States Constitution. It's based on the First, the Third, Fourth, Fifth, Ninth, and 10th Amendments to the United States Constitution. Nobody remembers what the Third Amendment is. Most people can remember the First because it provides 5 substantive rights: speech, press, religion, assembly, petition of government for redress of grievances. The Third says they can't quarter soldiers in private homes during peace times. Now, this is something that was particularly offensive to the Founding Fathers because the British used to just quarter soldiers in people's homes. The soldiers would just show up at your farm and you had to, let them in. Soldiers eat. They would, maybe take your cattle or your hogs or your chickens. And that was particularly offensive. So the court says that you have this idea in the Constitution of privacy, and we're going to protect it in Griswold versus Connecticut. Griswold was the paternal case for a progeny case called Roe versus Wade in 1973. Anybody know what Roe versus Wade said in 1973?
Was it that the states couldn't choose?
The states couldn't choose what?
For abortion to be?
Yeah, the states had no ability to regulate at various points, at least within the first trimester, whether or not somebody could have an abortion, right? Most states had a prohibition against, again, the marketing and performance of abortion. And Roe versus Wade says can't do that, at least within the first trimester of pregnancy. In the second trimester, the state may have some interest in protecting the health of the mother, and they can have some regulation. And it isn't until the third trimester where you start to say that the state has maybe some interest in protecting life, right? So that was Roe versus Wade, which comes out of Griswold versus Connecticut. So the reason that this is important is because after Roe versus Wade falls, and the states can now regulate abortion, in a concurring opinion, Justice Thomas says that the Supreme Court should revisit all of its substantive due process cases. So there are two types of due process that we talk about. One is called procedural due process, PDP. Procedural due process. And the idea behind procedural due process is, you see this in criminal law, that if you establish procedures for something, it protects individual rights. You all can think about this in relation to yourself. If you, for example, are accused of academic misconduct, right? Like cheating on an exam, submitting a paper that you plagiarized, which is easy to do today, right? Because you can get on ChatGPT and it will come up with your paper for you. And what is that? It's using large language sets to develop stuff. And currently, it's fairly easy for those of us who have been at this for any length of time to determine whether or not you've used something like ChatGPT or some other artificial intelligence thing, right? I can particularly tell with business students when they're using it. How can I tell? It's beautifully written. And if you use ChatGPT, particularly in my course, it may come up with sites that are made up. It'll just make stuff up. It'll make up facts that didn't occur. Now, there are other AI programs that don't do that. This happened, actually, a lawyer used very recently ChatGPT to come up with a brief, and they submitted that brief to the court, and the court was going through the citations and found out that the case law that was cited didn't exist. Just made it up. So if you're accused of doing something like that, plagiarizing, or using, an AI without the class. I mean, we've been told that we are supposed to now embrace artificial intelligence, right? It is going to be an enormously, every business I know, so I teach sales, I've coached our sales team, things like that. Every business I know are now using AI to develop sales persuasions for their businesses that are hiring our sales students, right? So this is enormously important, right? Going back to the case law and things like that, Roe versus Wade falls. So procedural due process says that if you're accused of using something like artificial intelligence, when your professor said you need to do this on your own and not use ChatGPT, on this exam. This is an essay exam. You can't use ChatGPT on it, and it turns out you use ChatGPT. Well, what are you going to want to defend yourself? If, let's say, you're not guilty of this crime, but you're going to want, is it up to just the professor to decide that you're thrown out of the university? You can be thrown out of the university and a notation placed on your transcript that you were dismissed for academic dishonesty. What does that mean? Well, when you go to apply to another school, what do you have to do?
You have to explain that whole.
Yeah, you're going to have to tell them, because one of the things that you do when you apply to another school is they'll ask you. Now, you could lie about it and say, this is the first school I've been to. But if they find out about that, and in an age in which we can find things out very, very quickly, the chances of you getting caught, in the 1970s, if you were dismissed from one school for academic misconduct, you might be able to go to another school in another state, nobody'd ever know, and get a degree. If you didn't want to bring any of those credits over, right? You're going to have to explain this. Let's suppose that this isn't really what happened. What are you going to want? Well, are you going to want the professor to be the judge, jury, and executioner, so to speak? No, right? You're going to want some neutral third party to hear this case. And you're going to want to be able to present evidence. That's all procedural due process, right? And then we have substantive due process. Well, what is substantive due process? Well, it's for example, the 5 rights found in the First Amendment to the United States Constitution. Those substantive rights we think are important in protecting. So why is free speech important? It's a substantive due process right, free speech, that's found in the Constitution of the United States. Why is that important? Well, if you don't have free speech, it's one thing to say, okay, we're going to have a neutral arbiter, right? And we're going to let you appeal the decision of the faculty member to throw you out. But if you can't speak, if it's just like, well, we're going to let the faculty member speak and not let you speak, you can't protect your rights, right? So that's a substantive right. It gives you not just the procedure, but the ability to say, and not have it, maybe used against you, or the right to remain silent, right? So these are rights that are found in the Constitution. And some of them, the substantive rights, were not necessarily mentioned, but they're extensions of other rights the court has found through case law over the course of our history. Justice Thomas says we should revisit all of those rights. What does that mean? Well, the current administration has people in it that are now advocating not just for the overturning of a woman's ability to have an abortion. There are people in the administration now that are advocating for, and this is not a political statement, this is a statement of fact, for overturning the ability of companies to market contraception, to go back to saying that the law before Griswold versus Connecticut is what we should have. And so you can't sell these things like birth control. Right? Now, if I ask you whether or not we should be able to market birth control in the United States as businesses, whether or not we should be able to sell these kinds of things, I'd be willing to bet that there's a wide variety of opinions in here on that. The position of the Holy Roman Catholic Church is what? Anybody know?
Conservative?
By conservative, what do you mean?
Um,
Birth control is immoral.
Yeah.
That's their position. There are not many Catholics, by the way, who follow that. When I was a kid, and I grew up in New Mexico, which was a largely Catholic state, right? It was the predominant denomination when I was growing up, when I was born in 1973 in Santa Fe, New Mexico. That was the predominant religion. Catholic families were huge. Like most of the kids that I went to school with, I went to a Roman Catholic school. My father was Roman Catholic, and I went to Catholic school until we moved to Oklahoma in 1986. And the only reason I didn't go to Catholic school after that was because we lived in Guthrie, and the Catholic school only went to 6th grade. In order for me to go to Catholic school, I would have had to have been driven down to Bishop McGinnis, and that was a long drive. So I went to public school, but my brother went to Catholic school. When I was a kid growing up, Roman Catholic families were like lots of the families, like lots of the kids that I went to school with had 6, 7, 8, 9 siblings. Most Catholic families today don't have 6, 7, 8, 9 siblings, right? So, but that's the position. If I ask questions like that, those are really hard questions, and it doesn't seem to give us an answer. Like if I give you a data set and say, figure this out. By the way, most of the time when we talk about statistics, this is the standard deviation for a population. And a population is defined as a well-defined collection of units. Normally what we're talking about is samples. So that's generally standard deviation equals X bar Xi minus X bar I equals 1 to the n over n minus 1. So that's the standard deviation for a sample. And you lose 1 degree of freedom when you go from population to sample. So we will get an objectively correct answer to that. If I ask you about whether or not we should be able to market contraception, well, there's probably going to be a wide variety of opinions on that, depending on where you stand, right? Depending on things like faith. So it doesn't seem to be as objective. But I think what we can find is that if we use logic and critical thinking, we can arrive at what are more or less objective truths in marketing. So logic and critical thinking and argumentation are important in marketing. So what is an argument technically? What does anybody know what an argument is technically? And what we're going to do throughout the course of this class is make lots and lots of arguments about the way we market goods and services, the way we engage in internal marketing with internal constituencies to the business. So what is an argument? There's an apocryphal story about W.C. Fields. It goes like this. W.C. Fields is coming out of the Brown Derby in Hollywood one day, and he was a notorious drinker. And a woman comes up to him and says, "Mr. Fields, you're an alcoholic and you're drunk." And he said, "Yes, madam, but you're ugly, and in the morning I'll be sober." Is that an argument? Is that an argument? There may be heated words that follow from that, but it's not an argument. Students often tell me, "I just don't like to argue. I don't want to argue." Arguments are fundamental to everything we do in marketing, because that may be a fight. Arguments are not about fighting. Arguments are about presenting evidence to persuade people, and we do this constantly in marketing, right? Advertising is fundamentally argumentation for why you should select the goods and services of a producer. And sometimes it's done poorly. Let's look at an example of this. Hopefully my live stream won't shut off. YouTube has a tendency to. All right, so that was an award-winning ad. Super Bowl ad many years ago. It's one of my favorite commercials. I use that when I teach integrated marketing communication. What's the argument that they made there? Anybody remember the business that it was selling? Don't remember. It was a horrible ad I mean, it was a creative ad. It was funny. It did one of two things that ads should do. It engaged the mind of the consumer, but it failed to deliver a selling message because the argument got lost in thinking about the ad, right? What was the argument? It was made at the end. In a sense, that's what we do. We bring ideas and people together and get them to go where they want to go. It was an ad for EDS. That's an argument. If you want to, EDS was a company that was owned by Ross Perot, H. Ross Perot, who was the first billionaire to run for president. He ran against Bill Clinton and George Herbert Walker Bush in 1992, which was the year I graduated from high school. And he was a funny guy. He was a little short guy. He owned EDS. He was a larger than life character, even though he was very short. When he was running for president in 1992, he said, George Herbert Walker Bush had gotten us into the first Gulf War. This country called Iraq had invaded a neighbor country called Kuwait and taken them over. And George Herbert Walker Bush said, we're going to go in and we're going to get Iraq out of Kuwait because we're fighting for democracy. And those of us who knew anything about politics got out a map of the Middle East and started looking around. And was Kuwait a democracy? It was an absolute monarchy. So when Papa Bush realized what he had said, he said, well, we're fighting to end aggression. And Ross Perot runs for president. He says, now, he was a little guy, had big ears. He said, now, if I go over and start a war in the Middle East so that we can replate the gold fixtures on some emir's bathroom, just drag me out the White House and shoot me. And if anybody has a better idea, I'm all ears. And it was pretty funny. Right? He was the CEO of EDS. And that ad makes an argument. We get people together, like the cat herders were getting cats together, but it wasn't a really effective argument because it got lost. Engage the mind of the consumer, but it wasn't a great argument. So arguments are important. Arguments are providing reasons. They're not about fighting. They're about providing reasons for taking a course of action. Why we should do something other than X. Why it is better that we engage in regulation of markets rather than just have absolutely open and unregulated markets for things like medical devices, pharmaceuticals, things like that, right? So we're going to look at arguments from a logical standpoint. Now, let me ask you this. One of the things that I've said or suggested that people find difficult about ethics is that it seems subjective. So there are courses that we teach on a college campus that seem subjective. If you go over to the College of Fine Arts and Design, they teach courses in things like drawing, right? And I'm not a very good artist. My mother was a fantastic artist. If you get me to draw it, I can paint with oil paints somewhat, but I'm not a good sketch artist. My figures have a tendency to be like stick figures rather than, I'm not a good portraiture artist. My mother was. One of the things we say about art is that Beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Whether or not a piece of artwork is good is subjective, right? So we teach these subjective things on a college campus, like portraiture. Let's look at it, I mean, Self-Portrait by Salvador Dali. Beautiful. I don't know. Right? Seems subjective. Then we teach things on a college campus like science, physics. That seems objective. So is everything that we teach on a college campus either an arts or science? Math. Art or science?
Science.
Not sure. Math may be the language of science, but there are theoretical mathematics that don't have any application to the real world. And that seems, it's a logic game, right? But it's not necessarily a science, because if it doesn't have any application to reality, is it a science? I don't know, but it is logical. I think there's a third category, which is pure logic that we teach. And we teach courses in logic and critical thinking here. And it's one of the things that I think we should have. So, those in-depth courses are beyond the scope. But what I want us to do is I want us to get to the point where we make reasonable arguments. So arguments and marketing are not about fighting. They're about persuading customers, constituents, clients, and others to accept our points of view. Why is it that we should buy product X? Think about drug. We're one of only 2 nations on the planet that allow direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical sales. No other countries except the United States and New Zealand allow big pharma to sell directly to consumers. We're the only ones. Is that a good thing or a bad thing? And we're going to make an argument. Like, is it good or bad to allow direct consumer advertising of pharmaceutical products? You can make logical arguments both ways. Why is it that other countries don't allow, even countries that are probably more free than the United States, on rankings of freedom across the world? The United States ranks pretty high, but there are countries that are more free than we are. According to organizations, NGOs that rank individual liberty across the globe, there are countries that are more free than the United States. And those countries don't allow direct consumer advertising of pharmaceuticals. Why? Because those countries don't believe that corporations are people. Politicians get in trouble when they say things that are true. When Mitt Romney was running for president, Mitt Romney was a senator from Utah. Before that, he was a governor of Massachusetts. Ran for president a couple times, lost. And in one of his campaigns for president, like some reporter in the crowd asked him about, hey, Governor Romney, at the time he had not been in the United States. They said, hey, Governor Romney, what about, like corporations and this idea that they have, speech rights? And he's like, corporations are people, my friends. And everybody laughed. That's true. From a legal standpoint, corporations are people. What does that mean? A corporation is a legal entity on its own. It can own property in its own right. It survives its founders in many instances. Ford is an example of this, right? Who started Ford Motor Company? Who?
Henry Ford.
Henry Ford, yes. Henry Ford started the Ford Motor Company to market the first mass-produced automobile in the world, the Ford Model T. And that company has survived. He's been long dead. And Ford Motor is still around today, right? Henry Ford died a long time ago. Now, some of his family were still involved with the Ford Motor Company until very recently, but it's a publicly traded company. You can buy stock in Ford. Survived, right? It is a legal entity. It owns property like plants and facilities and intellectual property like designs, patents, things like that, right? So, we make these persuasions, we make these arguments all the time. Should we allow companies like, Abbott Labs or, some of the other big pharma to directly advertise? Well, other countries say, like, corporations are not real people. They don't have free speech rights, and therefore they can't advertise to customers or constituents. Why? Because these people are not in a position to evaluate whether or not a drug is effective. We need to leave that to people with expertise. What has it resulted in the United States? We see advertisements for drugs, and we run to our doctor and we tell our doctor what we want, rather than the doctor telling you what you should have. That seems backward to most other nations in the world. Like, you shouldn't be running to your doctor and saying things like, what's the big one today? Anybody know what that we're marketing and that you're seeing lots of ads for? And it's very debatable as to whether or not we should be doing this. What's one of the biggest problems that we face in this country today in terms of our health? Obesity, yes, obesity. Like, we're facing an obesity crisis. The number of people, for the first time in human history, the number of overweight people equals the number of starving people in the world. This is a problem. And drug companies have come up with, now they developed this drug for diabetics to help control blood sugar levels, A1C levels, right? But what they noticed was, in giving this drug to these people through the drug trials, that what happens to them? They lose weight. And everybody's running out and wants these drugs now, even if they're not diabetic. Semaglutide, which is found in things like Rybelsus. You've got people, they're prescribing it. People are running out because they see the advertisements for diabetics where it says, Mounjaro may help you, may control your blood sugar and also help you lose a little weight. And it turns out that if you're not diabetic, it can help you lose a lot of weight. It doesn't seem to be as good a weight control for diabetics, but if you're not diabetic, like, it can help you lose a lot of weight. I know people who've gone, literally, they even have terms for this. They call it like semaglutide face, because you lose the weight so quickly that one of the first things that happens is you start losing it in your face, right? Should we do that? Marketing direct to consumers has led to this phenomenon where we run to the doctor and say, I want to try this, and doctors prescribe it. And in other countries, they think that is absolutely insane to do that. Like, the doctor is the one who has the expertise to know whether or not, and there are problems. There are I mean, every drug has side effects with this, right? So you can make arguments that maybe the rest of the world has this right. We value the First Amendment so much that we say like this, we want more speech. And I think there is a positive to this phenomenon of allowing direct consumer advertising. One of the things, so for example, my father he's retired now. He was a special agent in charge of the United States Department of Justice, Federal Bureau of Investigations, field office in New Mexico. So he was an FBI agent, special agent in charge. He's 89 years old now. Been retired for a long time. When he went into the Bureau, if you had been seen by a psychiatrist or psychologist, it was an a priori bar to employment with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. At the time he went into the Bureau, way before I was born. If you'd ever been seen by a psychiatrist or psychologist, the federal government thought you were crazy and they wouldn't hire you. You could not get a security clearance. Now, would the federal government like hire a psychiatrist to evaluate you? Yep. But if you'd ever gone and seen one on your own, that was it. A priori bar against employment. One of the things that direct consumer advertising has done of things like Prozac is it's made us aware of the fact that these are common human conditions that are not necessarily indicative of someone being crazy, but that life is hard, right? And maybe we should have discussions. I think when I was a kid growing up, people thought that if you went to see a psychiatrist or psychologist, something must be wrong with you. We no longer think that way. And it's largely as a result, I think, in my opinion, of direct consumer advertising of things like Prozac. Now, the bad part of that is, the downside of it is that I think we can fix everything with a pill. If your dog dies, you're probably going to be sad. And that's a normal human emotion. I'm not sure that we should take a pill for that, right? So arguments are about making these persuasions, not about fighting. One of the first rules that we have to think about when we talk about arguments is structure of the argument. We use these terms interchangeably in many instances, and they're not. So we use the terms valid and invalid, and we often think that they're the same as true and false. They're not. Valid and invalid go to the structure of the argument, whether or not it is logical. You can have a validly structured argument that is not true, and you can have an invalidly structured argument that is true, or you can have a validly structured argument that's false, or an invalidly structured argument. So what we want is we want both a valid structure to the argument and one that's true when we talk about this. Now, there are lots of examples of this. If you take the LSAT, which I did because I'm an attorney, I went to law school, right? If you take the LSAT, there are all of these logic games on the LSAT. They're getting rid of them, by the way, which I think is a horrible idea, to get rid of those. Those logic games are logically structured. They're valid arguments that you have to figure out, but they're completely made up, right? So again, is everything an art or a science? I think pure logic can be a third category that we teach on a college campus. Mathematics, if it's pure logic, is a third category. So in this example, if it rains, the streets get wet. It rained, therefore the streets are wet. This is a validly structured argument. It's called the modus ponens, the mode of putting. If I said that today, would it be true? No. There's absolutely 0% chance of precipitation in the Oklahoma City metropolitan area today. So it's valid. Today, if I said it, it wouldn't be true. If I said it, if it rains, the streets get wet. It rained. Nope. Looking outside. No clouds. Streets not wet, right? Tomorrow, maybe a different story, right? Because what's happening tomorrow? Don't like the weather in Oklahoma, stick around, it will change. So said Will Rogers. Beautiful day today, tomorrow, what's gonna happen? It's gonna rain. Allegedly, right? So we want both valid and true in our arguments. So structure is important. What's an example of one that's not valid? If it rains, the streets get wet. It did not rain, therefore the streets are not wet. This is called denying the antecedent. If it rains, the antecedent, this is the antecedent of the sentence. If it rains, the streets get wet. This is called the consequent. Antecedent, consequent. It did not rain, therefore the streets are not wet. Why is that not a valid argument? So we're saying if it rains, the streets get wet. That's perfectly valid. It rained, therefore the streets are wet. If it rains, the streets get wet. It did not rain, therefore the streets are not wet. What's wrong with denying the antecedent? Do the streets only get wet if it rains?
No.
No. The streets get wet a lot of times in Oklahoma because people leave their sprinklers on, right? You could have a water main burst and the streets would get wet. You could have a dam break and the streets could get wet, right? There's lots of alternatives. So it overlooks alternatives. That's the problem with this structure. Now, it may be true. The streets may not be wet. You know, nobody's watering their yards this time of year for the most part. They turn those watering systems off, those sprinkler systems off this time of year. So that may be true, but it's not a valid structure. You have to distinguish, rule number 2, you have to distinguish between your premise and conclusion. This is one that I've heard students and I use, I've heard students in this class argue this before. The Bible is the word of God who wrote it. That's not true, by the way, right? God did not sit down at the cosmic word processor and type this out. No. In the words of Archbishop Desmond Tutu, the Bible is the word of God through the words of men speaking in the idiom of their time. The Bible says God exists, therefore God exists. This is called begging the question. It's an example of circular reasoning, using your conclusion as a premise, right? So you got to distinguish, and you cannot use your conclusion as a premise. That begs the question. It's not logical. But people do this all the time. In political marketing, they'll make these arguments all the time. You'll find it in political arguments all the time. Present your ideas in a natural order. Rule 3. One way of doing this that's nice is maybe historical or chronological order, if you're talking about historical arguments. So when I'm talking about things like Supreme Court cases, that's the way we argue. That's the way the courts develop things, is through case law, through precedent, applying principles of past cases to present situations, right? In many instances, this may not be the most, in marketing, best order, because we might want something like the primacy effect. What's the primacy effect? This is called the inverted pyramid. So if you go to journalism school, they teach you to write this way. You start out with your headline that tells you, basically what the story is going to be about. Because the idea is you start out, you invert the pyramid, you start out with your strongest arguments first, because people are going to stop reading the details, right? As you go through it. So you want to be able to figure out, for example, a headline might be President Trump signs, 75 executive orders on his first day. I don't remember how many he signed. Don't, right? So, and then it's going to tell you as you get into the article what those 75, but that he signed 75 or however many it was on his first day in office, right? So the inverted pyramid. Or you might go for recency. The idea that you should put your strongest argument last because it's the one that people will remember, the one that they will take away, right? You should avoid emotionally charged language. Now, we don't do this very often, and it's one of the things that I think is ethically problematic about arguments in marketing. We often use emotion. Emotions are enormously powerful in marketing. Why was the herding cats commercial why was it an award-winning commercial? It used emotion, and that emotion was humor. And by the way, humor is not necessarily one of the ones that really sells well. But it was funny, it engaged the mind of the consumer, and it used emotion, humor. Why? Because there's this sort of cognitive dissonance that you experience when you see these rough and tough cowboys, sitting there, herding these cats and being very gentle with these little kittens, right? So, we tend to not avoid emotionally charged language oftentimes in marketing. It is a problem because one of the things that we can argue from an ethical standpoint is that you're engaging in manipulation of people. So you should avoid emotionally charged language. What's an emotionally charged? No sensitive person believes X. Well, generally speaking, belief systems may involve a wide variety of things that may be based on both logic and emotion. And to say somebody's not emotionally sensitive is using emotionally charged language. Rule number 5, consistency. Use consistent terms. I see this in political marketing all the time. They switch, and particularly the news will do this. They'll talk about, a liberal versus the conservative, and then they'll say, radical leftist, because they think you need to have sort of variety in your speech in order to keep people interested. And from a rhetorical standpoint, that's true. From a logical standpoint, if you start switching terms in the middle of your argument, it confuses people, right? So use consistent terms. And in marketing, that could be a positive, right? It's called the 3 exposure hypothesis. Say the same thing over and over 3 times, and people will get it. Stick to one meaning for each term. The example I give here is there was a book that came out many years ago that was very popular, written by somebody who had kind of a questionable PhD. I think it was a fake PhD, called Men Are From Mars, Women Are From Venus. And one of the things that he argued in that book, among many other arguments that he made, is that we take this idea of equality, maybe too far because the men and women are just not the same. Well, equality before the law is something different than equality of abilities. All of us in this room have different abilities, but I will treat you equally in that I will give you access to the materials and the same opportunities, right? Equality of opportunity is different than equality of results. Samples. We do this a lot in marketing. 4 out of 5 doctors recommend, or 4 out of 5 dentists recommend. When we say things like that, one of the things that you should think about as consumers, when you hear these kinds of marketing persuasions, your ears should perk up and say, well, first of all, how did you get those 4 out of 5 doctors? Tylenol forever and ever and ever said the most trusted brand of pain reliever by 98% of hospitals. Well, you want to know how they got 98% of hospitals to use Tylenol as the #1 brand of pain reliever? They gave it to hospitals for free. And hospitals then, if you get a Tylenol, they bring it up from the pharmacy, they're going to charge you for it. If you've ever been in the hospital, look at your bill. My mother was in the hospital, before she died, and I went through the bill, and there was something like cough support device. Now this sounds important, doesn't it? Cough support device. You know what it was? It was a pillow. They gave her an extra pillow so that she would be elevated. Cough support device. No amount of anecdotal evidence constitutes a scientific sample, right? Arguments by analogy, if you're going to use arguments by analogy, and we do this a lot in marketing, you will see this every time you go to the store. It will say, for example, if you take Tylenol, There will be an Equate brand, or if you go to Walmart, I think Walmart's medical product brand is Equate, isn't it? I think that's right. Let me make sure. There will be an Equate brand. I'm pretty sure it's their store brand. Yeah, it's I think it's Walmart's store brand of, like, their store brand of other stuff and food is Great Value, I think. In terms of pharmaceuticals, it's Equate. So it'll say compared to the ingredients in Tylenol, right? And that's roughly proportional. The thing that's different may be the coating on the pill that you're taking that allows you to swallow it easier, but it's compared to the ingredients, and there's rough proportionality. A lot of times when we talk about ethical arguments, you see people making arguments by analogy that are not proportional in any way, shape, or form. Rule 9, citation. Authorities must be cited, and most importantly, authorities must be qualified. I have a friend who does this consistently. He doesn't believe in man-made anthropomorphic climate change. Just doesn't. He works for NOAA, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, right? He's not a climate scientist at NOAA. He works as the director of IT at the Radar Operations Center. He's constantly sending me these people that have PhDs that claim that climate science doesn't suggest that human or anthropomorphic climate change is occurring. The last one he sent me is this guy who has a PhD, and he's written various papers that are self-published, and the guy's a geologist. And I'm like, Robert, stop sending me this stuff. He's like, well, he's got a PhD. Geology is the stuff that happens from the surface down. Climate is the stuff that happens from the surface up. He's got papers. Yeah, on his website. Not qualified, right? Just because you have a PhD, I have a PhD. I'm not a climate scientist, right? You have to avoid ad hominem attacks. This is personal attacks on individuals in arguments about logic and critical thinking. Rule number 10, correlation. Correlation doesn't equal causation. Two correlated events may have a common cause. For example, I read a paper in my doctoral program called Toaster Ovens Predict Family Size in India. Turns out that the number of electronic devices inversely correlated to the size of families in India. So do toasters and electronic devices cause infertility? No. Why is there an inverse relationship? Well, the more electronic devices you have, the more likely you are to be a wealthier individual, and the more wealthy you are, the fewer children, in many instances, in many countries, that you're probably going to have, right? So correlation does not equal causation. You have to avoid complex questions. Complex questions are ones where, for example, in my own research, there's an instrument called the EPQ that has this question that says, no code of ethics that's so rigid should be codified because it may interfere with better human relations and development. Now that's what we call a double. Now this has been a widely used instrument. The problem with that question is that there's a difference between, it's what we call a double-barreled question, because there's a difference between human relations and human development. Human development is an internal characteristic to the individual. Human relations is an external phenomenon, right? Human relations is whether or not I communicate well with you. That's human relations. I could do that poorly. Talking is hard, right? My whole life, my careers have been, I've been a politician, I've been an attorney, I've been a college professor. Those all involve talking. It's hard. Talking's hard. Most people say that they would rather go to the dentist than get up and give a speech. I don't understand that because I like talking. I like hearing my own voice. But it's hard. I may not communicate well with you, but I may be a well-developed person, right? There are lots of people who don't communicate well, but they're, you know, they're self-sufficient, they're happy, you know, they may just not be good communicators. So it's a double-barreled question. So you need to stick to one issue per question. Any questions about that? All right, so your assignment for next time, for next week, is to answer the following question, and I will send an email out with this so that you can have it. What is justice? So you guys need, in your groups, need to develop a definition of what is justice first, and the second question, what does justice have to do with marketing? If you got ducks, come and see me, and I will give you your points.
Okay.